Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the soft hiss of waves against shingle, the distant cry of gulls, and the gentle creak of wooden pier boards beneath your feet. Picture the year 1903, when the seaside was not yet a place of casual abandon, but rather a carefully choreographed theater of propriety, where every glance carried weight and every accidental touch sent ripples through the rigid social order. Tonight, we're traveling to the Edwardian Seaside, where romance bloomed in the most peculiar ways, constrained by corsets and convention, yet somehow all the more poignant for its restraint. We'll walk the promenades of Brighton, feel the starch of bathing costumes against sun-warmed skin, and witness the elaborate dance of courtship that played out against a backdrop of salt air and shifting tides. Before we settle into this world of whispered conversations and meaningful parasol adjustments, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on these quiet journeys through time. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let the sound of my voice carry you back to an era when love moved at the pace of a leisurely stroll along the pier ... Verse 1. A week at Brighton, 1903. The morning light filters through the lace curtains of the Grand Hotel, casting delicate patterns across the wallpaper, a riot of cabbage roses in shades of cream and dusty pink. It is Monday, the 7th of September, 1903, and Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore adjusts her stays with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has been corseted since the age of 13. The whalebone presses against her ribs in that familiar, almost comforting way, creating the fashionable S-curve silhouette that marks her as a woman of refinement. Through her window, Brighton spreads before her like a carefully arranged tableau. The chain pier stretches into the pewter gray sea, its delicate ironwork catching the early light. Already, figures in dark clothing dot the promenade ladies with their parasols, creating small pools of shade. Gentlemen in morning coats walking with measured steps, their walking sticks tapping a gentle rhythm against the boards. Adelaide has come to Brighton for her health, or so she tells herself. At 26, she is approaching that delicate age when society begins to whisper about spinsters and missed opportunities. Her mother, writing from their Yorkshire estate, has made the purpose of this seaside sojourn abundantly clear in her latest letter. The sea air will do you good, my dear, but remember that it is not only your complexion that might benefit from the change of scene. The ritual of dressing for the morning promenade requires nearly an hour. First, the chemise of finest lawn, then the corset with its 18 steel bones, laced by her maid Sarah, until Adelaide's waist measures a respectable 22 inches. The bustle follows, creating that distinctive silhouette that makes walking an art form in itself. Then the walking dress, a creation of navy blue wool with intricate braiding at the cuffs and collar, the skirt sweeping the ground with each carefully measured step. But it is the gloves that matter most. Soft kid leather in pearl gray, buttoned with tiny mother-of-pearl fastenings that require a special hook to secure. These gloves will remain on her hands for the entire morning, removed only for the ritual of taking tea. They are both armor and invitation protecting her skin from the sun and salt air, yet allowing for those brief, electrifying moments when gloved fingers might brush against another's in the most seemingly innocent of circumstances. By 10:30, Adelaide joins the morning parade along the promenade. The wooden boards beneath her feet are already warm from the sun, and she can smell the peculiar mixture of sea salt, seaweed, and the faint perfume of face powder that seems to hang in the air wherever fashionable ladies gather. Her parasol ivory silk with Valenciennes lace trim casts delicate shadows across her face, protecting her complexion from the Brighton sun that has already proven more robust than expected. The promenade operates according to unwritten but absolute rules. One walks at a measured pace, neither rushing nor dawdling. Conversations are conducted in modulated tones, suitable for the outdoors, yet never loud enough to suggest anything common. Ladies acknowledge acquaintances with the slightest inclination of the head, while gentlemen tip their hats with practiced precision. To walk too quickly suggests haste, which implies business, which is vulgar. To walk too slowly suggests leisure, which in excess implies uselessness. It is on Tuesday morning that Adelaide first notices him. He stands near the bandstand, apparently absorbed in reading his newspaper, The Times. She notes with approval, but she catches him glancing up at the passing parade of morning walkers. He is perhaps 35, with the upright bearing that suggests military service, though he wears civilian clothes of obvious quality. His mustache is perfectly waxed, his morning coat impeccably tailored, and when he removes his hat to acknowledge a passing elderly lady, she observes that his hair is beginning to thin at the crown in a way that somehow makes him appear more distinguished rather than less. Their first acknowledgement comes on Wednesday, as Adelaide pauses to adjust her parasol, practiced maneuver that allows for a discreet survey of one's surroundings. Their eyes meet for perhaps 3 seconds. He inclines his head slightly. She responds with the barest suggestion of a nod, and both immediately look away. The entire exchange occupies no more than 5 seconds, yet Adelaide finds herself thinking about it for the remainder of her walk. The rules governing such encounters are complex and absolute. A lady cannot speak to a gentleman to whom she has not been properly introduced. A gentleman cannot approach a lady without invitation. Yet the seaside offers certain relaxations of these strictures. The shared experience of sea air and salt spray creates a temporary community where the usual barriers might, with infinite care, be gently lowered. Thursday brings the first accident. Adelaide, having paused to examine the flowers in the municipal garden, finds herself walking toward the pier at the same moment as the gentleman. Their paths converge naturally at the entrance, where the press of other visitors creates a moment of gentle confusion. In steadying herself against the slight jostling, her gloved hand brushes against his sleeve. "I do beg your pardon," she murmurs, the prescribed response to such contact. "Not at all," he replies, his voice carrying the cultured tones of public school and university. The crowd does seem particularly enthusiastic this morning. They walk onto the pier in the same general direction, maintaining the proper distance, yet somehow moving as if by unspoken agreement toward the far end, where the fishing boats bob in the harbor and the noise of the promenade fades to a comfortable murmur. Here, with the excuse of observing the fishermen at their work, they might stand perhaps 6 feet apart and engage in the most carefully neutral of conversations. The boats appear to have had good fortune, Adelaide observes, noting the baskets of silver fish being unloaded. Indeed, though I confess I know little of such matters. I find myself more interested in... He pauses, as if considering whether his next words might be too forward. In the human drama that plays out here each day, it is a bold statement, suggesting as it does that he has been observing not just the boats, but the people, possibly including herself. Adelaide feels the slight acceleration of her pulse that her corset makes impossible to hide, a quickening that she hopes her careful composure conceals. There is something rather theatrical about seaside life, she agrees carefully. All of us playing our parts in this temporary community. By Friday, they have achieved what might charitably be called a friendship. She learns that he is Mr. Edmund Hartwell, recently returned from service in India, has taken to timing his morning walks to coincide with hers. Their conversations, conducted at precisely the proper distance and volume, range across topics both safe and subtly meaningful. They discuss the weather with the intensity that others might reserve for philosophy. They examine the architectural merits of the pier with the focus of archaeologists. They debate the relative qualities of Brighton versus other seaside resorts with the passion of diplomats negotiating treaties. Yet beneath these surface conversations runs an undercurrent of meaning that both acknowledge without ever naming. When Adelaide adjusts her glove, smoothing the kid leather over her wrist in a gesture both practical and unconsciously sensual. Edmund's attention focuses with an intensity that suggests awareness of more than mere fashion. When he points out architectural details, his hand gesturing toward the ornate ironwork of the pier, she finds herself studying the strong, capable fingers that his own gloves cannot entirely disguise. The breakthrough comes on Saturday, when a sudden shower drives the promenading crowds to seek shelter. Adelaide finds herself pressed against the glass front of a milliner's shop, her parasol useless against the slanting rain. Edmund appears beside her, having apparently run from some distance, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled by the weather. "Might I suggest," he says, slightly out of breath, "that we take shelter in the tea room? I believe I see tables by the window where we might wait for this to pass." It is a moment of decision that both recognize. To accept would mean sitting together, sharing a table, engaging in conversation without the buffer of movement and public space. It would represent a definitive step forward in whatever relationship has been developing between them. Adelaide's pause lasts perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for Edmund to begin formulating a graceful withdrawal before she nods. "That would be most sensible," she says, her voice steady despite the flutter beneath her ribs. The tea room is warm and slightly steamy from the sudden crowd of weather refugees. They find a small table near the window where they can watch the rain streak the glass and observe the occasional hardy soul hurrying past with collar turned up against the storm. The ritual of ordering and serving tea provides a comfortable structure for their first extended private conversation. But it is when Adelaide removes her gloves necessary for the proper handling of teacup and saucer that the true intimacy of the moment reveals itself. Her hands, freed from their kid leather covering, appear almost shockingly bare. The skin is pale and soft, unmarked by sun or labor, with the faint pink marks left by the tight-fitting gloves visible at her wrists. She performs the tea service with practiced grace, her movements economical and elegant. Yet Edmund finds himself fascinated by these glimpses of her ungloved hands as they navigate cup and saucer, sugar tongs, and cream pitcher. When she passes his cup, their fingers brush for just a moment, skin against skin this time, without the barrier of gloves. The contact lasts no more than a second, yet both feel the slight electric shock of direct touch. Adelaide's cheeks color faintly, a becoming rose that she cannot quite hide behind her teacup. The rain appears to be lessening, Edmund observes, though both can see that it continues to stream down the windows with undiminished enthusiasm. "Yes," Adelaide agrees, understanding that he is offering her the opportunity to leave, to restore the proper distance between them. Though perhaps not quite yet. They remain at their table for 45 minutes, long after the rain has stopped and the promenade has resumed its normal activity. Their conversation ranges more freely now, touching on books they have read, places they have traveled, opinions they hold on subjects both weighty and trivial. Yet always there remains that careful attention. It is only when Adelaide drops her handkerchief, a maneuver so obviously calculated that both she and Edmund recognize it as the pleasant fiction it is, that they achieve their final moment of semi-privacy. As Edmund retrieves the delicate square of cambric and lace, their gloved hands touch briefly in the transfer. "I shall not forget this week," he says quietly, his words meant for her alone, despite the public setting. "Nor shall I," she responds, accepting the handkerchief with a small smile that acknowledges both the artifice of the dropped handkerchief and the sincerity of the sentiment. Monday morning brings the ritual of departure trunks loaded onto carriages, tearful farewells between new friends who may never meet again, promises to write that will likely be forgotten before the first letter is posted. Adelaide, dressed in her traveling costume of dark green wool, observes the choreographed chaos from the hotel's front steps while waiting for her own carriage. Edmund appears beside her with the practiced casualness that has characterized all their encounters. "I trust your journey back to Yorkshire will be comfortable," he says, his formal tone carrying undercurrents of meaning that only she can interpret. "I am confident it will be," she replies. "And I hope your return to London proves equally satisfactory." They shake hands, a perfectly proper farewell between acquaintances, yet both are aware of the slight pressure of fingers, the momentary lingering of the clasp that speaks of promises and possibilities. As Adelaide's carriage pulls away from the Grand Hotel, she turns for one last glimpse of Brighton's promenade. Edmund stands on the hotel steps, his hat raised in farewell, his figure growing smaller as the carriage gains speed. Yet the memory of the week remains vivid and complete: the sound of waves against shingle, the feel of salt air on her face, the flutter of excitement when gloved hands accidentally touched. Within a fortnight, his first letter will arrive at the Yorkshire estate, properly addressed to her father, but clearly intended for her. The courtship that began with careful glances across the Brighton promenade will continue through the winter months in drawing rooms and at dinner parties, following the established patterns that govern such affairs. But its true beginning lies in those September mornings when love moved at the pace of a leisurely stroll along the pier, constrained by convention, yet somehow all the more meaningful for its restraint. Verse 2, the poet who drowned for love. The transition from Adelaide's carefully orchestrated romance to our next story requires us to shift our gaze from the respectable promenades to the wilder shores of passion. Yet even here, in this tale of ultimate romantic tragedy, we find the peculiar constraints of Edwardian sensibility shaping every gesture, every word, every fateful decision. In the summer of 1907, 4 years after Adelaide Whitmore's successful Brighton courtship, another figure haunted the seaside resorts of England's southern coast. His name was Algernon Fitzwilliam Thorne, and he carried with him the particular melancholy that seemed to cling to minor poets of the era, like sea mist to woolen clothing. Algernon was 31 years old, possessed of the kind of ethereal handsomeness that photographs of the period captured so well all prominent cheekbones and haunted eyes, with hair that fell across his forehead in a manner suggesting both artistic temperament and careful arrangement before the mirror. He had published one slim volume of verse, Echoes from the Shore, which had been received with a kind of polite interest, reserved for works that were neither offensive enough to condemn nor brilliant enough to celebrate. The circumstances that brought Algernon to Eastbourne in July of 1907 were themselves a study in the complexities of Edwardian emotional life. He had spent the previous 3 years in a state of what his contemporaries would have termed devoted attachment to Miss Constance Harrington, the daughter of a prosperous Manchester cotton merchant who had invested wisely in colonial ventures and now maintained houses in both Cheshire and Belgravia. Miss Harrington was 24, possessed of what her circle considered striking, rather than merely pretty features, dark hair that she wore in the Gibson girl style, intelligent gray eyes, and a figure that the new, slightly relaxed corseting of the period displayed to advantage. More significantly, she had received what was then called an education, not merely the usual accomplishments of piano playing and watercolor painting, but actual instruction in literature, history, and even rudimentary scientific principles. She read Browning and Tennyson with genuine appreciation, held opinions about social questions, and had been heard to express views on women's suffrage that, while not radical, suggested a mind capable of independent thought. The courtship between Algernon and Constance had followed a pattern both typical and tragic. They had met at a literary salon in London, one of those carefully orchestrated gatherings where young people of similar interests might encounter each other under properly chaperoned circumstances. Algernon had read from his poetry a selection of sonnets, inspired by his walking tours of the Lake District, and Constance had approached him afterward to offer what she clearly intended as intelligent appreciation of his work. "Your treatment of the relationship between natural beauty and spiritual longing," she had said, her voice carrying the slightly self-conscious tone of someone who has rehearsed such literary conversation, "reminds me of Wordsworth, yet with something more ... contemporary in its sensibility." For a man who had received mostly polite silence in response to his verse, Such perceptive comment fell like rain on parched ground. Algernon found himself looking into Miss Harrington's gray eyes with an intensity that made her color slightly and glance away, a response that he interpreted with the optimism of the romantically inclined as encouragement rather than discomfort. Their subsequent meetings followed the prescribed pattern of Edwardian courtship, yet with the added dimension of shared intellectual interests. They attended lectures together, properly chaperoned, of course on subjects ranging from recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt to the social novels of Mrs. Gaskell. They engaged in lengthy correspondence, their letters growing gradually more personal as the months passed, moving from formal discussions of literature to tentative revelations of opinion, preference, and eventually, carefully veiled emotion. Algernon's letters, in particular, revealed the intensity of feeling that his reserved public manner concealed. "When I observe the sunset from my window," he wrote in one preserved example, "I find myself composing descriptions not for their own sake, but in the hope of sharing through words some fraction of beauty's effect upon the soul. Yet increasingly, I discover that the sunset itself seems incomplete without the presence of a sympathetic observer, one whose appreciation might double the experience through the alchemy of shared perception." Such language, flowering and indirect as it was, clearly indicated the direction of his feelings. Constance's responses, while warmer than mere politeness required, maintained a careful emotional distance that Algernon, in his growing infatuation, misinterpreted as maidenly reserve rather than genuine uncertainty. The crisis came in the spring of 1907, precipitated by Mr. Harrington's decision that his daughter had enjoyed sufficient time for literary friendships and must now consider her practical future. Constance found herself presented with a choice between the romantic but financially precarious poet and a more substantial suitor, Mr. Geoffrey Pembroke, a barrister of established practice and comfortable inheritance, whose courtship had proceeded alongside Algernon's with the steady persistence of a man confident in his eventual success. The scene of rejection took place in the Harringtons' Belgravia drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon in May, with the London plane trees visible through the tall windows and the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones providing a civilized backdrop to personal devastation. Constance, dressed in an afternoon gown of dove-gray silk that emphasized the color of her eyes, had requested a private interview with Algernon, as private as propriety allowed, with her mother stationed in the adjoining morning room within call if needed. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her hands folded carefully in her lap, in a pose that suggested both composure and constraint, "I have asked to speak with you because our friendship has reached a point where clarity becomes essential." Algernon, who had entered the room with hopes of a very different conversation, perhaps even a declaration of mutual affection that might justify approaching her father about his intentions, felt his heart begin to race with a premonition of disaster. "I have valued our correspondence and our shared interests more than I can easily express," Constance continued, her voice steady but her eyes fixed on her folded hands rather than his face. "Your insights into literature and your poetic sensibility have provided me with intellectual companionship of a kind I had not previously experienced." The careful past tense of her phrasing did not escape Algernon's notice, yet he clung to hope, even as it began to drain away. "However," she went on, and in that single word he heard the collapse of all his romantic imaginings, "I have come to realize that friendship, however valued, cannot provide the foundation for the more permanent connection that my parents, and indeed, my own practical nature, require me to consider." What followed was a masterpiece of Edwardian emotional restraint. Constance explained, with gentle but devastating precision, that she had accepted Mr. Pembroke's proposal of marriage. She expressed genuine regret for any disappointment this might cause Algernon, emphasized her continued high regard for his character and talents, and suggested that their intellectual sympathy would make a continuation of their friendship both natural and appropriate, under the altered circumstances, of course. Algernon received this intelligence with the external composure that his upbringing and social position demanded. He congratulated Miss Harrington on her engagement, expressed his hopes for her future happiness, and agreed that their friendship had indeed been a source of mutual benefit. Only the slight tremor in his voice and the way his hands gripped the brim of his hat betrayed the magnitude of his internal devastation. The interview concluded with a handshake, formal gesture that seemed to mock the intimacy of their previous correspondence, and Algernon found himself standing on the Belgravia pavement with the afternoon sun casting long shadows and the normal bustle of London, life continuing around him as if nothing of significance had occurred. The weeks that followed were marked by Algernon's gradual withdrawal from his usual social connections. Friends noted his absence from literary gatherings, his failure to respond to invitations, his increasingly infrequent appearances at his club. Those who encountered him reported a man clearly suffering from what their generation termed disappointed affections, yet who maintained the surface courtesy that his class demanded even in extremity. His poetry during this period, judging from the manuscripts found among his papers, took on a darker cast. Gone were the nature lyrics inspired by Wordsworth, replaced by verses that dwelt obsessively on themes of loss, rejection, and the inadequacy of art to console the wounded heart. One fragment, written in his careful hand on hotel stationery, captures the flavor of his mental state. The tide retreats, yet leaves no mark. Upon the smooth and virgin sand, so beauty's promise, glimpsed in dark. Moments of hope, leaves empty hand. It was in this condition, emotionally wounded, artistically frustrated, and increasingly isolated from his normal supports, that Algernon made the decision to spend the summer months at the seaside. He chose Eastbourne, partly for its reputation as a resort favored by invalids and those seeking recuperation, partly because its relative distance from London made encounters with his former social circle unlikely. The Grand Hotel at Eastbourne, where Algernon took rooms for what he initially planned as a fortnight's stay, specialized in a kind of genteel melancholy that seemed to attract guests recovering from various forms of disappointment. The clientele consisted largely of middle-aged widows, retired military officers nursing old wounds, and young people whose pallor suggested recent illness or emotional distress. It was exactly the sort of place where a broken-hearted poet might hope to find either sympathy or blessed anonymity. Algernon's daily routine quickly established itself around the rhythms of convalescent life. He rose late, breakfasted in his room, and spent the morning hours walking the less fashionable portions of the seafront, where the presence of working fishermen and local residents provided a contrast to the artificial gaiety of the main promenade. His afternoons were devoted to writing or attempting to write in a small notebook that he carried with him to various secluded spots along the shore. It was during one of these solitary afternoon sessions, seated on a wooden groin with his notebook balanced on his knee and the sound of waves providing a melancholy accompaniment to his thoughts, that Algernon experienced what can only be described. The story of Algernon Fitzwilliam Thorne became, in time, one of those cautionary tales that circulated quietly among the literary circles of Edwardian England. It served as a reminder of the dangers of excessive romantic sensibility, of the need for young people to maintain proper perspective on matters of the heart, and of the wisdom of parents who insisted upon practical considerations in matters of marriage. Yet for those who understood the full circumstances, Algernon's tragedy represented something more complex, a collision between genuine feeling and social constraint that illuminated the costs of a system that prized form over authentic emotional expression. His death was both ridiculous and genuinely tragic, both the result of personal weakness and social failure. The seaside setting of his final act added its own layer of meaning to the story. The beach had always served as a liminal space in Victorian and Edwardian culture, a place where the usual social rules relaxed slightly, where emotion might be permitted more direct expression and drawing room conversation allowed. Yet even there, on the margin between land and sea, between civilization and nature, Algernon had found himself unable to escape the emotional constraints that had doomed his love from the beginning. His death became part of the folklore of English seaside resorts, one of those melancholy stories that seem to attach themselves to certain stretches of coastline. Hotel staff would sometimes point out the groin where he had spent his final afternoon, writing in his notebook while the waves whispered their fatal invitation. Guests of a romantic disposition found a peculiar pleasure in visiting the spot, imagining themselves into the mind of the doomed poet and feeling a delicious shiver at their own emotional daring. Yet perhaps the most telling aspect of Algernon's story was its aftermath, or rather, the lack thereof. Within a year, his death had faded from general memory, surviving only as a minor footnote in literary histories and a cautionary tale shared among families with marriageable daughters. Constance Pembroke lived a long and apparently contented life, bearing 3 children and involving herself in various charitable endeavors. If she ever thought of the young poet who had loved her so desperately, she left no record of such reflections. The sea itself, indifferent to human drama, continued its eternal rhythm against the eastbourne shore. The waves that had claimed Algernon's life were followed by countless others, each one erasing a bit more of the tragedy's immediate impact, until nothing remained but the story itself, a perfect embodiment of Edwardian emotional life in all its constrained intensity and tragic restraint. Verse 3. The lost photographs of disappearing lovers. As we move from the tragic certainty of Algernon's story to our next investigation, we enter a realm of mystery that has puzzled collectors and historians for over a century. It requires us to shift our attention from the grand gestures of doomed romance to the quiet, domestic evidence of countless smaller heartbreaks, the peculiar phenomenon of torn cabinet cards that began appearing in seaside towns throughout England in the early 1900s. The mystery first came to public attention through the observations of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, a dealer in photographic ephemera who maintained a shop in the lanes of Brighton. Blackwood had spent the better part of 2 decades collecting and selling the formal portraits that Victorian and Edwardian families commissioned to mark important occasions, wedding photographs, family groups, individual portraits of children in their Sunday best, and the increasingly popular seaside commemoratives that couples ordered during their holiday courtships. It was in the autumn of 1908 that Blackwood first noticed an unusual pattern among the photographs being offered to him by various sellers. Cabinet cards, those formal portraits mounted on heavy cardboard backing that had become the standard format for professional photography, were arriving at his shop in a damaged condition that seemed to follow a consistent pattern. The photographs had been carefully torn in half, always vertically, always separating what had obviously been couples photographed together. The first such damaged photograph that caught Blackwood's attention featured a young woman in an elaborate hat decorated with silk flowers and feathers, her gloved hand resting on what appeared to be the back of a chair. The photograph had been torn with obvious deliberation, removing the male figure who had clearly been standing beside her. The tear was clean and precise, suggesting the use of a ruler or straight edge, rather than the ragged damage that might result from anger or haste. What made this particular photograph intriguing was not merely its damaged condition, but the care with which it had been preserved despite the alteration. The remaining portion had been carefully maintained, with no signs of the casual handling that might be expected if the image had been discarded in a fit of emotion. Someone had deliberately removed half of the photograph while preserving the remainder with obvious care. Over the following months, Blackwood began actively seeking out similar damaged photographs, driven by the collector's instinct that recognizes a pattern worthy of investigation. His inquiries among other dealers in photographic materials revealed that the phenomenon was not limited to Brighton. Similar torn cabinet cards were appearing in shops and estate sales from Scarborough to Bournemouth, all showing the same distinctive characteristics: professional quality, seaside settings, and that careful vertical tier that removed exactly half of what had been couple portraits. The photographs themselves provided tantalizing clues about their origins. The clothing and poses suggested dates ranging from 1902 to 1912, placing them squarely within the period when seaside photography had become a popular souvenir of romantic holidays. The backings bore the stamps of studios in every major coastal resort: Ramsgate, Eastbourne, Margate, Weymouth, and dozens of smaller towns where enterprising photographers had established seasonal businesses catering to the tourist trade. What distinguished these particular photographs was their obvious quality and the care that had been taken with their composition. These were not casual snapshots, but formal portraits, the kind that required appointments with established studios and represented significant financial investment. The subjects were clearly persons of some social standing, judging from their clothing and the elaborate props that the studios provided: carved chairs, painted backdrops depicting romantic landscapes, even artificial flowers arranged to suggest garden settings. Yet despite the obvious expense and care involved in their creation, someone had systematically destroyed half of each image. The question that consumed Blackwood's attention was why, and perhaps more intriguingly, who had been removed from these carefully preserved partial portraits. Blackwood's investigation led him to seek out the original studios where these photographs had been taken. Many had closed by the time of his inquiry, their proprietors having retired or moved on to other ventures. But those photographers who remained in business proved surprisingly forthcoming about their memories of the period in question. Mr. Septimus Hartwell, who had operated a successful studio in Eastbourne from 1895 to 1920, proved particularly helpful. Hartwell maintained detailed records of his commissions, including careful notes about the circumstances surrounding each photograph. His ledgers revealed that a significant portion of his business during the peak years of 1905 to 1910 had consisted of what he termed engagement portraits, formal photographs commissioned by couples who had become engaged during their seaside holidays. The procedure was quite standard, Hartwell explained to Blackwood during their interview. The young lady and gentleman would arrive at the studio, usually accompanied by a chaperone or family member. They would select from our various backdrops and pose arrangements, with the gentleman typically standing and the lady seated, though sometimes both would stand with the gentleman's hand resting on the lady's shoulder in a gesture of protection and affection. What made Hartwell's account particularly interesting was his recollection of the specific instructions these couples gave regarding the finished photographs. They would invariably order multiple copies, he recalled, usually 6 or 8 prints, some for the respective families, some for the couple themselves. But I began to notice a curious pattern. The young ladies would often request an additional copy of just themselves, asking me to crop the image to remove the gentleman's portion. At first, I assumed this was for economy, a smaller print being less expensive, but when I offered to provide the cropped version at no additional charge, they invariably insisted on paying for a full-size print that they would then crop themselves. This revelation provided Blackwood with the first concrete evidence that the torn photographs were not the result of later emotional upheaval, but had been deliberately planned from the moment of their creation. The young women commissioning these portraits had anticipated the possibility that they might someday wish to preserve their own image while removing that of their companion. Further investigation revealed that this practice had been sufficiently common to develop its own discrete terminology within the photographic trade. Studio assistants referred to these specially requested partial portraits as insurance copies, while the photographers themselves sometimes called them contingency prints. The phenomenon was apparently well known within the industry, though rarely discussed openly due to the delicate nature of the emotions involved. Mr. Hartwell's records proved invaluable in reconstructing the stories behind individual photographs. His careful notes revealed that many of the engagement portraits had been commissioned by couples whose relationships existed in a state of uncertainty, young people whose families had not yet given formal approval to their courtship, or whose financial circumstances made immediate marriage impossible. They were purchasing hope, Hartwell observed, his tone carrying the philosophical weight of a man who had witnessed countless human dramas through the lens of his camera. The photograph served as a kind of promissory note evidence of their intention to marry, should circumstances permit. But the young ladies, being perhaps more practical than their suitors, often seemed to anticipate that circumstances might not, in fact, permit. The specific stories that Blackwood uncovered through Hartwell's records provided poignant illustrations of the complex social and economic pressures that governed Edwardian courtship. One photograph, featuring a young woman in a particularly elaborate hat trimmed with ostrich feathers, had been commissioned by Miss Dorothy Ashworth and Mr. Cecil Pemberton in August of 1906. Hartwell's notes indicated that the couple had met during a house party in Yorkshire and had conducted their courtship through a series of carefully chaperoned encounters at various fashionable resorts. According to Hartwell's recollections, Miss Ashworth had been particularly insistent about the insurance copy, going so far as to return to the studio the following day to ensure that the cropping had been executed to her satisfaction. She was quite specific about the angle of the cut, Hartwell remembered. It had to preserve the detail of her costume in the studio's backdrop, while removing any trace of the gentleman's presence. The subsequent history of this particular photograph provided a perfect illustration of the foresight that had motivated such precautions. Hartwell's records showed that he had been contacted 6 months later by Miss Ashworth's mother, requesting that all remaining prints of the couple's portrait be destroyed. The engagement had been terminated, apparently due to financial difficulties in Mr. Pemberton's family that made marriage impossible. Miss Ashworth had apparently anticipated this possibility and had prepared accordingly. Yet the story did not end with the broken engagement. The same photograph appeared in Blackwood's collection 3 years later, offered for sale by a dealer in London who had acquired it as part of a larger estate purchase. The torn cabinet card showed only Miss Ashworth, resplendent in her ostrich-trimmed hat, but bearing no trace of the gentleman who had once stood beside her. Someone, presumably Miss Ashworth herself, had preserved this carefully cropped image through her subsequent marriage to a different suitor, keeping it as a memento of a summer romance that had promised much but delivered little. A pattern that emerged from Blackwood's investigations suggested a widespread practice among young women of the period, a kind of emotional insurance policy that allowed them to preserve the memory of their seaside romances while protecting themselves from the potentially embarrassing evidence of relationships that had not culminated in marriage. The torn photographs represented not angry destruction, but careful curation, a selective editing of personal history that reflected the complex social pressures of the era. What made this practice particularly poignant was the evidence it provided of the gap between romantic aspiration and social reality. These were not casual holiday flirtations, but serious courtships that had reached the point of formal photography, a significant step in the elaborate progression of Edwardian romance. Yet the very act of commissioning insurance copies suggested an awareness that such relationships existed in a precarious state, subject to forces beyond the control of the individuals involved. The economic pressures that governed marriage in this period were particularly evident in the stories Blackwood uncovered. Young men might find their financial prospects suddenly altered by changes in family fortunes, shifts in business conditions, or the discovery of previously unknown debts. Young women might find themselves obligated to accept more advantageous offers from suitors whose economic stability outweighed their romantic appeal. The seaside photographs captured these couples at the moment of their greatest optimism, before the practical considerations of marriage had imposed their harsh realities. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Blackwood's investigation was his discovery that the practice of commissioning insurance copies had been sufficiently widespread to influence the standard poses and compositions offered by seaside photographers. Studios began arranging their couple portraits in ways that would facilitate later cropping, ensuring that the female subject could be preserved in isolation without awkward gaps or obvious evidence of alteration. Mr. Hartwell's studio, for instance, had developed a signature pose that placed the female subject in the center of the composition, with the male figure positioned slightly to one side in a way that allowed for clean removal. The props were arranged to create a balanced composition even after cropping, and the lighting was designed to ensure that the remaining portion of the photograph would appear complete and professionally finished. This evolution in photographic practice represented a fascinating accommodation between commercial enterprise and emotional necessity. The photographers were essentially providing a service that acknowledged the uncertain nature of Edwardian courtship while maintaining the romantic fiction of permanent commitment. They were complicit in creating images that could be selectively edited. The mystery of the torn photographs ultimately revealed itself to be a window into the emotional life of a generation caught between Victorian restraint and modern possibility. The young women who commissioned these insurance copies were neither passive victims of social pressure nor entirely free agents of their own romantic destiny. They were instead careful navigators of a complex social landscape, using the tools available to them to preserve what they could of their romantic experiences, while protecting themselves from the potentially devastating consequences of relationships that society might not permit to flourish. In the end, Blackwood's investigation provided more than just answers to a collector's curiosity. It revealed a hidden chapter in the history of English romantic life, a story of love carefully managed and memory selectively preserved. The torn photographs that had first attracted his attention proved to be not mere curiosities, but artifacts of a particular moment when the tension between individual desire and social constraint required such elaborate emotional accommodation. The mystery was solved, but its solution only deepened our understanding of the complex ways in which people of the past had learned to navigate the difficult territory between the heart's desires and society's demands. The torn photographs remain as testament to both the intensity of Edwardian romantic feeling and the practical wisdom of those who learned to love within the careful constraints of their time. Verse 4, the fishermen who laughed at them. Our final journey takes us away from the manicured promenades and formal photographic studios to the working shores of Edwardian England, where a very different community observed the elaborate courtship rituals of the tourist classes with a mixture of amusement, bewilderment, and occasional grudging respect. Here, among the men who made their living from the sea, the careful romantic choreography that we have been exploring appeared as foreign as the customs of a distant country, simultaneously entertaining and incomprehensible. The fishing communities of England's coastal towns existed in a curious relationship with the seaside resorts that had grown up around them. These were settlements that predated the Victorian discovery of the seaside by centuries, places where families had worked the same waters and followed the same seasonal rhythms for generations beyond memory. The arrival of the tourists, first the invalids seeking the curative properties of sea air, then the holidaymakers pursuing pleasure and romance, had transformed their world in ways both beneficial and profoundly unsettling. In the small fishing village of Cromer, on the Norfolk coast, the contrast between the two communities was particularly stark. The fishermen lived in cottages that crowded close to the harbor, their lives governed by the tides and the weather, their work beginning in the darkness before dawn when the tourist hotels were still and silent. By the time the visitors emerged for their morning promenades, the fishing boats were already returning with their catch, their crews beginning the long process of sorting, cleaning, and preparing the fish for market. It was from this perspective of men whose days began with the practical business of survival and ended with the simple exhaustion of physical labor that the elaborate courtship rituals of the holidaymakers appeared most strange. The fishermen watched the tourists with the detached interest of anthropologists, observing an alien culture, noting the peculiar customs and inexplicable behaviors that governed the visitors' romantic lives. Old Tom Harker, who had worked the waters off Cromer for more than 40 years, became something of an unofficial chronicler of tourist behavior. His position as the operator of a small boat that took visitors on pleasure cruises around the bay gave him intimate access to the romantic dramas that played out among his passengers, and his naturally observant nature, combined with a dry sense of humor, made him an acute commentator on the follies of fashionable love. They come aboard my boat, Tom would tell his cronies in the Fisherman's Arms, dressed up like they're going to church, the ladies with their white gloves and their parasols, the gentlemen with their walking sticks and their watches on chains. And then they spend the entire voyage trying not to touch each other, like they're afraid they'll catch something contagious. Tom's observations, recorded in fragmentary form by a local journalist who recognized their anthropological value, provide a unique window into the way the working classes perceived the romantic conventions of their social superiors. His commentary reveals not only the obvious class differences that separated the two communities, but also fundamentally different approaches to the relationships between men and women. Now, when one of our lads takes a fancy to a girl, Tom explained, he walks up to her and says so. Maybe he brings her a nice piece of fish or offers to fix something that's broken in her father's cottage. If she's interested, she lets him know. If she's not, she tells him to bugger off. The whole business is settled in a week, and they're either walking out together or they're not. The contrast with tourist courtship could hardly have been more pronounced. Tom described watching young couples on his boat who had apparently been acquainted for weeks, yet still addressed each other with formal titles and maintained careful physical distance. He observed the elaborate protocols surrounding the removal of gloves, the significance attributed to the accidental brushing of fingers, the complex negotiations required before a gentleman might offer his arm to assist a lady over the boat's rail. I watched one pair, Tom recalled, who spent the entire cruise 2 hours, mind you, discussing the weather and the quality of the sea air. 2 hours. And meanwhile, you could see they were fairly burning up with wanting to hold hands. It was like watching someone die of thirst next to a well because they couldn't figure out how to work the bucket. Tom's perspective was shaped not only by the different social customs of his own community, but also by the practical realities of life among the fishing families. Marriage in Cromer was less a romantic ideal than an economic necessity, a partnership formed between individuals who understood that their survival depended on their ability to work together effectively. Romance, when it occurred, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the essential foundation of the relationship. The women here work as hard as the men, Tom observed. They mend the nets, they gut the fish, they manage the household while we're at sea. When our lads choose wives, they're looking for someone who can pull her weight, not someone who faints at the sight of a fish scale. And the women, they want men who can provide steady income and won't drink away the family's food money. Love might come later, but it's not what you build a marriage on. This practical approach to courtship made the elaborate romantic rituals of the tourists appear not only unnecessary, but actively counterproductive. Tom and his fellow fishermen watched the visitors' courtships with the bewildered amusement of people observing a particularly inefficient method of accomplishing a simple task. The physical awkwardness of tourist courtship was a particular source of entertainment for the fishing community. Tom described watching fashionable couples attempt to navigate the transition from boat to dock, a maneuver that required a certain amount of physical coordination and mutual assistance. The elaborate precautions taken to preserve the lady's modesty, the careful management of skirts and parasols, the gentleman's obvious terror of making improper contact while providing necessary support, all of this struck the fishermen as comically impractical. I've seen grown men freeze up completely when a lady needed help stepping off the boat, Tom recounted. They'd stand there paralyzed, afraid to put their hands anywhere that might be considered inappropriate, while the poor woman wobbled on the edge of the dock, trying to manage her skirts and her parasol and maintain her balance all at the same time. Meanwhile, one of our women would have been off the boat and halfway up the beach before the gentleman finished deciding where to place his hands. The seasonal nature of the tourist trade meant that the fishing community had months to discuss and analyze the romantic dramas they had witnessed during the summer season. These winter conversations, conducted in the village pubs and around the harbor while the men mended their nets, created a kind of collective folklore about the peculiar mating habits of the upper classes. The fishermen developed their own theories about the purposes served by the tourists' elaborate courtship rituals. Some believed that the complexity was designed to test the seriousness of potential suitors, that only a man truly committed to marriage would endure months of formal conversation and carefully chaperoned encounters. Others suggested that the lengthy courtship periods allowed families to investigate each other's financial circumstances thoroughly before committing to an alliance. But the most common explanation offered was that the tourists simply had too much time on their hands. When you're working 14 hours a day just to keep food on the table, observed Jimmy Crane, one of Tom's regular crew members, you don't have leisure to spend 6 months figuring out whether you fancy someone. You make your decision and get on with it, because there's always more work to be done tomorrow. This theory gained credence from the fishermen's observations of tourist behavior during their holidays. The visitors appeared to have endless time for activities that served no practical purpose, walking slowly along the promenade for hours, sitting in tea rooms engaged in lengthy conversations, spending entire afternoons arranging flowers or reading novels. From the perspective of men whose lives were structured around the practical necessities of earning a living, such leisure appeared almost incomprehensible. Yet despite their amusement at tourist courtship rituals, the fishermen were not entirely unsympathetic to the romantic struggles they observed. Tom Harker's accounts include several instances where he and his crew actively assisted couples who seemed to be struggling with the practical aspects of their romantic encounters. One such incident involved a young couple who had arranged to meet for what they termed a sunrise walk along the beach. The gentleman, apparently unfamiliar with the realities of tidal schedules, had planned their rendezvous for a time when the tide would be at its highest point, leaving no beach available for walking. Tom, who happened to be preparing his boat for the day's fishing, observed the couple's confusion and quietly suggested an alternative route that would allow them to achieve their romantic objective without getting their feet wet. They were so grateful, Tom recalled. You'd have thought I'd saved them from drowning. All I did was point out that the tide comes in twice a day, regular as clockwork, and if you want to walk on the beach, you need to check the tidal tables first. But they acted like I'd performed some kind of miracle. Such incidents revealed the gap between the tourists' romantic ideals and their practical knowledge of the coastal environment. The visitors often planned elaborate romantic gestures without understanding the realities of weather, tides, and seasonal conditions that would affect their success. The fishing community, with their intimate knowledge of local conditions, found themselves in the position of unofficial advisors to couples whose romantic ambitions exceeded their practical experience. The fishermen's wives added their own perspective to the community's collective understanding of tourist romance. While the men observed the courtship rituals from a distance, the women often had more direct contact with the female visitors, selling fish and shellfish to the hotels, cleaning rooms, or providing laundry services. This closer contact gave them insights into the private aspects of tourist relationships that the men could only speculate about. Mary Harker, Tom's wife, worked as a charwoman at the Grand Hotel during the tourist season. Her duties included cleaning the rooms and corridors, which gave her inadvertent access to the evidence of the guests' romantic lives, the carefully preserved letters tied with ribbon, the pressed flowers from romantic walks, the photographs displayed on dressing tables, the carefully guarded diaries that recorded the progress of courtships. They keep everything, Mary observed with a mixture of bewilderment and admiration. Every letter, every pressed flower, every little token of affection. I've seen ladies with entire drawers full of ribbons and lace and bits of this and that, all saved from their courtship days. It's like they're trying to capture every moment and preserve it forever. This preservation of romantic memorabilia struck the fishing community as particularly foreign to their own experience. In a world where practical considerations demanded constant attention to the present moment, the luxury of dwelling on romantic memories seemed almost self-indulgent. Yet there was also a certain wistful quality to their observations, a recognition that the tourists possessed something time, leisure, the freedom to focus on emotional rather than practical concerns that the working community could not afford. The class differences that separated the two communities were most apparent in their different attitudes toward the future. The tourists' elaborate courtship rituals were designed to establish relationships that would lead to marriages that might last for decades. The careful investigation of character, the gradual building of emotional intimacy, the thorough exploration of compatibility, all of this was predicated on the assumption that the participants had the luxury of choice and the security of economic stability. The fishing community, by contrast, lived with a much more immediate relationship to uncertainty. The dangers of their profession meant that marriages might be terminated abruptly by accident or illness, and the economic pressures of their lives meant that practical compatibility was more important than romantic attachment. This different relationship to risk and uncertainty shaped their perspective on the tourists' elaborate romantic precautions. They act like they're planning for eternity, observed Sarah Crane, Jimmy's wife, who worked as a seamstress for some of the hotel guests. Every decision has to be perfect. Every choice has to be exactly right, because they think they're setting the course for their entire lives. But life doesn't work that way. Things change, people change, circumstances change. You do the best you can with what you have and adapt as you go along. This philosophical difference extended to the community's different approaches to marriage itself. The tourist couples that the fishermen observed were clearly seeking marriages based on romantic love, emotional compatibility, and shared interests. The fishing community, while not dismissing the importance of affection between spouses, placed greater emphasis on practical considerations, the ability to work together, to support each other through difficulties, to contribute to the family's economic survival. The contrast was perhaps most apparent in the community's different attitudes toward the physical aspects of relationships. The tourists' elaborate precautions to avoid improper contact, their careful management of physical proximity, their obvious anxiety about maintaining proper boundaries, all of this struck the fishing community as unnecessarily complicated. When you're working side by side every day, explained Betty Morrison, whose husband ran a small fishing operation, you learn to be comfortable with each other's bodies. You see each other in all kinds of weather, in work clothes and Sunday clothes, when you're tired and when you're fresh. There's no mystery about it, and no need for all that tiptoeing around. You either suit each other or you don't, and the physical side of it is just part of the whole package. This matter-of-fact attitude toward physical intimacy made the tourists' romantic anxieties appear almost comical. The fishermen's wives observed the elaborate rituals surrounding the removal of gloves, the careful management of skirts during boat trips, the complex negotiations required before a gentleman might offer physical assistance to a lady, and wondered what purpose all this elaborate protocol was supposed to serve. Yet despite their amusement at tourist behavior, the fishing community was not entirely without sympathy for the romantic struggles they observed. The summer seasons brought them into contact with couples who were clearly experiencing genuine emotional distress over their romantic situations, young people whose families disapproved of their choices, couples whose economic circumstances made marriage impossible, individuals who were struggling with the gap between their romantic desires and their social obligations. Tom Harker recalled one particular couple who had taken his boat tour repeatedly throughout the summer of 1909. The young woman was clearly of higher social standing than her companion, and their interactions suggested a relationship that was both passionate and problematic. They would spend the boat trips engaged in intense, quiet conversation, their voices too low for Tom to overhear, but their body language spoke of emotional turmoil and difficult decisions. You could see they were torn up about something, Tom remembered. The lady would be crying sometimes when she thought no one was looking, and the gentleman had that look of a man who's been backed into a corner with no good choices. They kept coming back, week after week, like they were trying to work something out, but couldn't quite manage it. The couple disappeared abruptly in late August, and Tom never learned the resolution of their story. but their obvious distress had made an impression on him and his crew, serving as a reminder that beneath the elaborate social protocols and seemingly artificial romantic conventions, the tourists were struggling with genuine human emotions and real-world constraints. These glimpses of authentic feeling beneath the surface of formal courtship gradually modified the fishing community's view of tourist romance. While they continued to find the elaborate rituals amusing and impractical, they came to recognize that the constraints under which the visitors operated were as real and limiting as their own, though different in nature. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 brought an abrupt end to the golden age of seaside tourism, and with it, the regular summer entertainment that the fishing community had derived from observing the romantic dramas of their social superiors. The young men who had provided such amusement with their elaborate courtship rituals were now serving in France or preparing for military service, their romantic concerns replaced by more immediate concerns about survival. The war also brought changes to the fishing community itself. Some of the younger fishermen enlisted in the Royal Navy, their knowledge of boats and coastal waters making them valuable additions to the war effort. Others found their fishing activities restricted by wartime regulations, their familiar waters now patrolled by military vessels watching for enemy submarines. When the tourists began returning to the resorts after the war, both communities had been transformed by their experiences. The elaborate pre-war courtship rituals seemed to belong to a different era, replaced by a more direct approach to relationships that reflected the changed circumstances of post-war life. The fishing community, having seen their own young men go off to war, and in some cases not return, had developed a different understanding of the preciousness of time and the importance of seizing opportunities for happiness when they presented themselves. Tom Harker, now in his 60s and semi-retired from active fishing, continued to operate his pleasure boat service during the summer seasons. But the conversations he overheard among his passengers reflected the changed attitudes of the post-war world. The elaborate protocols of Edwardian courtship had given way to a more pragmatic approach to romance, one that the fishing community found much more comprehensible. "They're more like us now," Tom observed in 1922, reflecting on the changes he had witnessed. "They still have their fancy clothes and their hotel rooms, but they don't spend 6 months figuring out whether they fancy each other. The war taught them what we always knew, that life's too short and too uncertain to waste time on elaborate ceremonies when you could be getting on with the business of living." Yet Tom's final assessment of the pre-war tourist courtship rituals was more generous than his initial reactions had been. Years of observation had given him a deeper appreciation for the genuine emotions that had motivated the elaborate romantic protocols, even if he continued to find the expression of those emotions unnecessarily complicated. They were trying to do something beautiful, he concluded. All those rules and ceremonies and careful manners, they were trying to make something special out of the business of choosing a mate. It may have been impractical, and it certainly was inefficient, but there was something to be said for the effort. They were trying to turn courtship into an art form, and you have to respect that, even if you think they were going about it the wrong way. The fisherman's perspective on Edwardian seaside romance thus provides a final, illuminating contrast to the stories we have been exploring. From their vantage point of practical necessity and direct experience, the elaborate courtship rituals of the tourist classes appeared both foreign and fascinating, both amusing and oddly admirable. Their observations remind us that the romantic conventions we have been examining were not universal truths, but cultural constructions, shaped by the specific circumstances and constraints of a particular social class at a particular moment in history. The laughter of the fishermen was not cruel, but rather the natural response of one community, observing the customs of another. Their perspective serves as a valuable reminder that the elaborate romantic protocols of Edwardian seaside courtship for all their emotional intensity and social significance, were ultimately arbitrary constructions, no more natural or inevitable than the more direct approaches favored by their working-class observers. Yet the fisherman's ultimate acknowledgement of the beauty and meaning within those protocols also suggests that the elaborate courtship rituals served purposes beyond mere social display. They were attempts to create meaning, to transform the basic human need for companionship into something approaching art. The tourists' careful romantic choreography may have appeared inefficient to practical observers, but it represented a genuine effort to honor the significance of love and commitment through the creation of memorable, meaningful experiences. The contrast between these two approaches to romance, the practical and the elaborate, the direct and the ceremonial, illuminates the complexity of human relationships and the various ways in which different communities have sought to navigate the eternal challenge of finding and maintaining love. The fisherman's laughter, fond and tolerant in the end, reminds us that there are many ways to approach the fundamental human experiences of courtship and commitment, each shaped by the circumstances and values of its particular time and place. Conclusion. And now, as the tide retreats from the shore and the lights of the pier flicker out one by one, we come to the end of our quiet journey along the Edwardian Seaside. We began on the polished boardwalks of Brighton, where a week's worth of gloved glances and softly murmured observations turned into a subtle romance, more sigh than spark, more suggestion than declaration. We watched as Miss Adelaide Whitmore navigated the carefully choreographed ballet of propriety, every parasol tilt, every tea room encounter, part of a delicate language that lovers once spoke fluently. In the hush of that final walk along the pier, we saw how a nod and a half-smile could carry more emotional freight than entire letters today. And then we wandered into the shadows, where romance unraveled into despair. Algernon Fitzwilliam Thorne, our haunted poet, walked into the sea in full evening dress, a man who lived and died by the unspoken word. His tragedy wasn't born only of heartbreak, but of a time when even grief had to wear gloves and stand politely at the threshold. The great irony, of course, was that a world that feared emotional exposure produced so many hearts overwhelmed by feeling. Algernon's quiet goodbye, carefully composed on hotel stationery, remains not only a relic of personal pain, but a testament to a culture that prized formality even at the end. Then came the torn photograph, strange, intimate relics of a time when love had to be preserved cautiously cropped when it couldn't be sustained. These were not careless rages or afterthoughts, but deliberate acts. A cabinet card split in half was not the story of anger, but the quiet management of memory. An image trimmed to remove a lover's face was not an erasure, but a soft defiance against letting heartbreak take everything. To keep one half of a photograph is perhaps the most Edwardian way to grieve, a gesture restrained, precise, and profoundly human. And finally, we stepped back from all of it, watched from the weathered boats and salt-slicked docks where the fishermen stood. With the ease of practiced labor, they hauled nets and watched the tourists with bemused affection, finding both comedy and contradiction in their ornamental courtships. To them, romance was something you pursued between tides, negotiated over fish baskets and folding chairs. And yet, even as they laughed at the tourists' fumbling elegance, they understood, in their own way, that what those young couples were trying to do was make meaning. That the rules and rituals, absurd as they seemed, were attempts to elevate love from happenstance to ceremony. In their own voices, gruff and practical, we heard a final kind of wisdom, that no single way of loving is best or truest. Some relationships are built quickly, like a boat that must be made before the weather turns. Others are composed slowly, like letters folded and refolded over months of careful thought. The Edwardians, in their gloves and lace and anxious silences, tried to build love as one might build a cathedral slowly, reverently, with the tools they had, hoping the scaffolding would one day fall away to reveal something lasting. And maybe that's the thread that runs through all four of our stories. Love constrained by class, by time, by family and fear and the long shadows of duty. But still, love persistent, adapted, persistent again. A hand brushed against a sleeve. A letter folded and hidden away. A name spoken softly into sea wind. The form changed. The feeling did not. As we leave these figures behind Adelaide in her traveling coat, Algernon walking the beach alone, Dorothy with her carefully preserved half-portrait, Tom Harker watching from his boat, we do so with a sense that their lives were not so distant after all. Their world may have worn crinolines and mustaches, but its rhythms echo in our own, in how we love, in how we say goodbye, in how we try to remember the parts that matter and forget the ones that hurt too much. So now, if your eyes are heavy and the room has grown still, let yourself drift gently. Let the promenade fade into moonlight. Let the sound of the sea, always there in the background, always moving, always returning, carry you outward. Until next time, thank you for walking with us through this quiet place in history. Sleep well, and may your dreams be calm and softly strange.